Your soulmate is about to confess they're married. But that's not the biggest secret. Something shifted in their world the moment they realized they could no longer keep two truths hidden at the same time. There they were, sitting alone in the quiet of their room, staring at a message they had written, deleted, rewritten, and deleted again. Their phone screen went dark, but their eyes stayed fixed on it. Because the words they were afraid to send weren't about missing you. They weren't even about loving you. They were about something much harder to explain. They're married. And somehow, that isn't the part of this story that carries the greatest weight. Because the person you feel connected to has been carrying a secret that goes far deeper than a relationship status. There is a reason they kept certain conversations short. A reason they sometimes disappeared when everything between you seemed to be getting closer. A reason their voice changed whenever the future came up. And if you've ever wondered why their actions seem to contradict what you felt between you, there's a piece of information you've never been given. Tonight, imagine them standing in front of a mirror, rehearsing the truth. Their shoulders are tense. Their expression is completely different from the person you've known. They whisper the first sentence under their breath, stop halfway through, and look away. Because once they say it, there is no taking it back. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The marriage itself may not be the secret they have been most afraid to reveal. There's another chapter behind it. A chapter involving a decision they made long before they understood what meeting you would mean to them. And the strange part is, they've recently started realizing that the decision they once believed would protect everyone may have created an entirely different problem. You may have noticed the subtle changes already. The longer pauses before they answer. The sudden seriousness when you ask simple questions. The way they sometimes look at you as though they're trying to memorize the moment. Those aren't random details. They're signs of someone approaching a conversation they've postponed for far too long. And there's one particular moment you need to understand. Not long ago, they had an opportunity to tell you everything. They almost did. The words were right there. Then something happened that made them stop. They looked at your face, saw the trust in your expression, and realized that telling you the truth wouldn't simply change the conversation. It could change the way you saw them forever. So they stayed silent. But silence has a limit. And now, that limit is getting dangerously close. Because while you were wondering whether this connection was real, they were privately asking themselves a completely different question. How do I tell the person I care about the truth without destroying the one connection I never expected to find? Stay with this, because the answer isn't what you might expect. The marriage has a story. The confession has a reason. But the secret underneath both of them is connected to why they came into your life in the first place. And before they finally tell you the truth, there's one thing they discovered about their own past that changed the entire meaning of your connection. That's the part they haven't told you yet. The message was still sitting there when they finally stopped pretending they could ignore it. One sentence. Barely long enough to fill the screen. Their thumb hovered over the send button, then pulled away. They weren't afraid of admitting they were married anymore. They were afraid of what you would ask immediately afterward. Because the marriage had existed before you ever entered the picture, but something about meeting you forced them to confront a truth they had avoided for years. They had built a life around an obligation, a promise, or a decision that no longer reflected what they actually wanted. And recently, someone close to them had noticed the change. They'd asked, "Why do you look happier when you're talking to someone you're not supposed to be talking to?" Your soulmate didn't answer. They couldn't. Because saying your name out loud would make everything real. And here's the detail that makes their upcoming confession different from what you might imagine. They aren't preparing to tell you because they've suddenly become careless. They're preparing because hiding the truth has started to feel more painful than facing the consequences of honesty. There's a quiet difference between someone confessing because they've been caught and someone confessing because they can no longer live comfortably inside a story that isn't complete. That's where they are now. They've been replaying old conversations, remembering moments when you gave them opportunities to be honest, and realizing how many times they changed the subject. One particular conversation keeps returning to them. You asked what they really wanted from the future. They smiled, avoided your eyes, and gave you an answer that sounded safe. But inside, they knew it wasn't the truth. Now they wish they had answered differently. Because the secret they're carrying isn't simply, "I'm married." It's the reason they stayed in that marriage when their heart had already begun questioning everything. If this story is resonating with you, feel free to share it with someone who understands complicated love stories, and if you enjoy emotionally driven narrations like this, you can subscribe and stay with the journey. But don't let that small moment distract you from what comes next, because there is another person connected to this story who knows more than you've been told. Someone who recently said something that made your soulmate realize the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. It happened during an ordinary conversation, almost casually. A name was mentioned. A question followed. And suddenly, your soulmate went completely quiet. That person knew about the marriage, but they also knew something else. Something that happened before the marriage ever began. Something your soulmate has never explained to you because admitting it would reveal why they were never completely emotionally available in the first place. And when you learn what happened before they met their spouse, you'll understand why their confession is only the beginning of the story, not the ending. The name they heard that day belonged to someone from a chapter they thought they had permanently closed. For a few seconds, they couldn't speak. The room around them seemed to fade while an old memory came rushing back with uncomfortable clarity. It was the period of their life when they had made a choice based on pressure, expectation, and timing rather than genuine certainty. They had convinced themselves that love could be postponed. That happiness could wait. That choosing what looked responsible on the outside would eventually make everything feel right on the inside. Then you appeared. Not dramatically. Not with some perfect movie entrance. You simply entered their life and somehow made them notice everything they had stopped noticing about themselves. Your conversations awakened questions they had buried. Your presence made ordinary moments feel significant. And that frightened them more than they ever admitted. Because suddenly, the life they had carefully accepted began to feel like a life they had never truly chosen. But there's another layer to this, and this is where their secret becomes much more personal. Before they ever met you, they made a private promise to themselves. They would never allow their emotions to interfere with the life they had committed to building. They believed discipline could control the heart. They believed distance could prevent attachment. So when their feelings for you began growing, they tried to manage them quietly. They answered less often. They became careful with their words. They occasionally pulled away just when the connection seemed strongest. And you may have interpreted those moments as uncertainty about you. The truth was almost the opposite. They were uncertain about themselves. They knew that if they allowed one honest conversation to happen, everything they had been suppressing could come rushing forward. Then came the moment that changed their strategy. You said something completely ordinary. Something about wanting honesty, even when the truth was uncomfortable. They didn't react immediately. But later that night, those words stayed with them. For the first time, they realized that protecting you from the truth wasn't kindness if the silence itself was keeping you from making an informed choice. And now the confession is becoming more specific. They've already imagined how the conversation might begin. They know they'll have to tell you they're married. They know you'll probably have questions. They know there may be silence afterward. But what they haven't figured out is how to explain the part that matters most, what their marriage actually represents today, what has already changed behind closed doors, and why they never told you sooner. There is a decision they've been quietly considering, and it doesn't involve asking you to rescue them or promising you some effortless future. It involves finally taking responsibility for a life they chose and being honest about where they stand. That's why their next message may sound strangely different from everything they've said before. Less romantic. Less evasive. More direct. Because they aren't preparing to make a grand declaration, they're preparing to give you information you deserved much earlier. And just when you think the biggest revelation is simply that they're married, they're going to tell you what happened immediately after they realized they had developed feelings for you, and that moment may explain every confusing silence you've experienced. The moment they realized their feelings had crossed a line they could no longer explain, they did something you never knew about. They opened their phone, found your conversation, and began typing a message that was far more honest than anything they had ever sent you. They wrote that they needed to tell you something important. Then they stopped. They read it 3 times. Finally, they deleted every word. Not because the truth had disappeared, but because they suddenly understood the responsibility that came with telling it. They knew you deserved clarity, not another emotional conversation filled with half-answers. So instead of sending the message, they made a decision. Before speaking to you, they would have to face their own circumstances first. That was the beginning of a private process you never witnessed. Conversations at home became more serious. Questions about the future could no longer be avoided. And for the first time, they started looking at their marriage without excuses, asking themselves whether they were living honestly or simply continuing because changing direction felt difficult. Then came the detail that nobody around them expected. Their spouse noticed something had changed, not necessarily another person, but a new determination in them. They were no longer comfortable pretending everything was fine. One evening, during a quiet conversation, they were asked a simple question: "Are you actually happy?" The room went silent. Your soulmate could have given the familiar answer. Instead, they paused. That pause said more than a paragraph ever could. They realized that the truth wasn't about blaming anyone. It wasn't about turning their spouse into a villain or making themselves the victim. It was about acknowledging that a relationship can reach a point where honesty becomes more important than appearances. And somewhere inside that difficult realization was another truth: meeting you hadn't created the problems in their marriage. It had simply made them impossible to ignore. That's why the confession they've been preparing isn't meant to manipulate your emotions. It's meant to stop leaving you in the dark. If you've been following this story and it reminds you of someone whose actions never quite matched their words, you're welcome to share it with someone who might appreciate the perspective. And if you want to continue with this kind of emotional storytelling, subscribing is a simple way to stay connected. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story takes a sharper turn. After that conversation, your soulmate received something unexpected. It wasn't a romantic message from you. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was an old photograph. A photograph from a time before the marriage, before the confusion, before you were ever part of their world. They stared at it for several minutes, and then they noticed something in the background that brought back a memory they had tried to forget. That photograph connected their present situation to a decision they made years earlier, a decision involving another person, another promise, and a future they once believed was already settled. Suddenly, the marriage wasn't the biggest secret anymore. The real secret was why they had entered it in the first place. And when they finally tell you that part, you may understand why they've spent so long struggling to separate duty from genuine love. The photograph sat on the table long after they had stopped looking at it. It wasn't the person in the picture that unsettled them. It was the date written on the back. A date from a season of their life when everything had seemed certain. They remembered the conversation that happened shortly afterward, the promise they made, the expectations placed on them, and the decision they believed they had no reason to question. At the time, marriage seemed like the natural next step. There was stability, familiarity, a future everyone around them could understand. What they didn't recognize then was how much of that decision had been shaped by fear of disappointing people. They weren't deliberately creating a false life. They were trying to become the person everyone expected them to be. Years later, meeting you forced them to confront the difference between a life that looks right and a life that actually feels honest. And that realization is exactly why telling you they're married has become so difficult. They're not simply revealing a relationship status. They're revealing the story behind a choice they once thought would define their entire future. But there was one thing they never told anyone about that choice. Before the marriage, they had already experienced a moment that made them question whether they were ready. They almost walked away. They had a private conversation with someone they trusted and admitted they weren't completely certain. Then circumstances changed. A family expectation became stronger. A responsibility appeared. The timing became complicated. And instead of stopping to ask what they truly wanted, they convinced themselves that uncertainty was something they could outgrow. That decision followed them quietly. It didn't ruin every good moment in their life, and it doesn't mean every memory was false. That's what makes this story complicated. There were genuine moments of happiness. There were shared experiences. There were reasons they stayed. But somewhere beneath all of it was an unanswered question. Then you entered their life and accidentally touched that question. Not by demanding anything. Not by making promises. simply by being someone with whom they could speak openly. They began remembering what it felt like to be understood without having to perform a role. And now comes the secret that has been sitting underneath everything else. Your soulmate isn't only preparing to confess that they're married. They're preparing to tell you that they have already started making changes in their life because they can no longer pretend the old arrangement answers the questions they have been asking themselves. They haven't figured out every detail. They don't know exactly how the future will unfold. But they do know one thing. They cannot continue hiding behind silence and expect you to understand their behavior. That's why the next conversation may be unusually calm. No dramatic promises. No exaggerated declarations. Just honesty. They may tell you when the marriage began, why they entered it, what has changed since then, and why they kept you at a distance even when their feelings were becoming stronger. But there's still one missing piece. One fact they haven't said out loud to anyone. Not even the person closest to them. And that secret isn't about the marriage at all. It's about what they discovered after meeting you, something so unexpected that it changed the way they understood their own future. The first words of that confession may sound simple, but the sentence that follows could completely change how you see everything that happened between you. The sentence they have been rehearsing begins with 3 words: I need honesty. Not, I love you. Not, I made a mistake. Not even, I'm married. Just those 3 words. Because they finally understand that this conversation can't be built around emotion alone. It has to begin with truth. They imagine sitting across from you somewhere quiet, with no distractions and no convenient reason to leave. Their hands are still. Their voice is softer than usual. And for once, they're not searching for the perfect explanation. They're preparing to tell you what actually happened. They know the marriage will be the first revelation, and they know you may need time to process it. But what they desperately want you to understand is that their silence wasn't proof that you meant nothing. In their mind, it was the opposite. They were terrified that acknowledging what they felt would force them to confront every decision they'd made before you appeared. And now, after months of internal questions, they have reached a point where uncertainty feels heavier than honesty. Then they reveal something you wouldn't expect. When they first realized they were becoming emotionally attached to you, they didn't immediately move closer. They created distance. They changed routines. They tried to keep conversations practical. They convinced themselves that if they stopped giving the connection attention, the feelings would eventually disappear. But instead, the distance made one thing clearer. They began noticing how often their mind returned to you even when they were busy. A song would remind them of a conversation. A familiar place would bring back your laughter. A simple question someone asked would suddenly make them wonder what you were doing. It wasn't some dramatic overnight transformation. It was gradual, almost inconveniently ordinary. And that was what made it impossible to dismiss. They weren't caught up in a temporary fantasy. They were recognizing a genuine emotional connection that had become impossible to ignore. But here's the surprising part: the secret they fear revealing isn't that they have feelings for you. They already know you may suspect that. The secret is what those feelings made them realize about themselves. Because meeting you forced them to admit something they had avoided for years. They had been making important decisions based on what would keep everyone comfortable rather than what was truly honest for them. That realization changed their behavior. They started having conversations they'd postponed. They began setting boundaries where they had previously remained silent. They started asking what kind of life they actually wanted, independent of appearances and expectations. And this is where the story becomes more hopeful than heartbreaking. They're not looking at you as an escape route. They're looking at you as the person whose presence expands